I'm Anne Perkins. It's June 8th, 2019. My book is called Yale Needs Women, and it comes out in September 10th. Yale Needs Women tells for the first time the story of the first women undergraduates at Yale. They arrived in 1969, so just 50 years ago, to a campus that had been all male for the previous 268 years. Yale had only admitted them reluctantly and put in place a gender quota to keep their numbers down. Most of these young women were just teenagers, and yet they show a remarkable courage and resilience. My book follows the story of 5 of them. You know, they came from all over the country, from Los Angeles, from Houston, from Cleveland, from America's biggest cities to its smallest towns. Most of them were white, but 40 of those first women undergraduates were African American, 13 were Asian American, and 3 were Latina. They were smart and they were tough. That's how Yale picked them. I interviewed one of the 2 administrators who selected that first class of women, and I'll never forget what he told me. He said there was no point in selecting a timid woman and putting her in that situation because it could crush you. Well, when you think of that quota that Yale put in place, it meant that the women were outnumbered 7-to-1 by the men, so they were oddities. When I raised my hand in class and offer an opinion, one of the women wrote, the men turned to stare at me as if the furniture itself had spoken. And they were isolated. Yale took that small group of women and spread them out across all 12 of its residential colleges so that each group of men would have its own small cluster of women. And then, just like today, for some of the women, their college education included sexual harassment and assault. So if we take our finger and we put it on 2017, when the #MeToo movement exploded, and we try to trace it back to the first point when women spoke out publicly against sexual harassment, we would land in 1971 Yale. That is where, for the very first time, women used this phrase, sexual harassment. Yale women coined that term in a sex discrimination complaint that they file against Yale with the federal government. We've never heard that term before, the federal investigators who came down to talk with them said, and they promised they would look into it. Yale sees its mission as producing national leaders. And because men are leaders and women are not, or so the reasoning went, Yale wanted to use as few spaces as possible for women. It put a quota in place, therefore, of 1,025 men, reserving those spots in each entering class and limiting women to the 230 spaces that are left over. The fight to overturn that quota becomes the defining battle of the early years of coeducation at Yale and the central story of my book. They are remarkable, you know, and getting to know them has been one of the real gifts of writing this book. Shirley Daniels came from Boston, where I live, from Roxbury, which is Boston's Harlem, and she applied to Yale because it was one of the few colleges in the country that offered an African American Studies program at that time. Philadelphia athlete Lori Mifflin led the fight at Yale to change the policy that said only men could play varsity sports. Kit McClure was a musician. She played the trombone, and she came to Yale with this idea of playing in an all-women's rock band, which was totally unheard of at the time. And Connie Royster and Betty Spawn, who were roommates, have incredibly powerful stories of their own to tell, but they're also unique because they had something very rare at the time, which was an interracial friendship between 2 women. You know, it was a totally marketing decision. Yale was watching with alarm the growing number of students who were saying yes to Harvard and no to Yale. And when it talked to them and said, "How come you're turning us down?" the answer came back almost always the same. At Harvard, I can get a girlfriend by walking a few blocks to Radcliffe, but Yale men have to drive 2 hours to Vassar or Smith to get a date. So Yale needed women so that the top men would continue coming to Yale. When Princeton announced that it was considering going co-ed, Yale acted first and announced that it would admit its first women students.
So Princeton was all male too at the time.
You know, we forget this today, but up until 1969, many of America's most prestigious colleges were all male, from Amherst, Boston College, Bowdoin, Brown at the start of the alphabet, down to Williams, Wesleyan, West Point, and Yale at the end. They all refused applicants from women. And then when Yale announced in 1968 that it would accept its first women, and Princeton followed a few months later, that coeducation taboo is lifted in elite higher education in America, and a wave of coeducation sweeps through our colleges, changing higher education into what we know today. You know, serendipity a little bit. 7 years ago, I went back to school to get my PhD, and I was taking a higher education history course, and I decided to write a paper about these first women undergraduates at Yale. I had gone to Yale, but their story had not been part of my education at all there. And so I started reading, as one does, and I found that of all the histories of Yale in this era, not a single one of them had talked to women undergraduates about their experience. I was committed to changing that, and Yale Needs Women is the result.